Hey guys, my name is Max and welcome to Simple Biology. In this video we're going to be talking about metabolism. Now metabolism is the sum of all the chemical reactions and processes going on in an organism. Obviously this is huge when we talk about life because metabolism is what drives any process that enables life to occur. So that's why we're going to be studying that in this video. Now the first thing is metabolic pathways. A metabolic pathway is how a molecule is changed from one substance to another. In other words, the molecule will start as A here, and through a series of reactions, it'll change to B, then to C, then to D. That whole pathway as a whole is a metabolic pathway. There's two types of these metabolic pathways, catabolic and anabolic. The difference is that a catabolic pathway will release energy while an anabolic pathway will absorb energy. A good example of these are for catabolic pathways when you digest food. So say you eat a bunch of sugar. That sugar is going to be broken down, going to be digested, and eventually your body will just release carbon dioxide and water. And because it's breaking it down, that's going to release energy. It's a catabolic pathway. An example of an anabolic pathway would be for example, your body building up muscle. So in order to manufacture those proteins from their amino acid subunits, your body is going to use energy, and the anabolic pathway will absorb that energy in order to make the proteins that will be involved in your muscle. Oftentimes, catabolic pathways will be breaking something down, while anabolic pathways will be making something out of its smaller pieces. So that's an easy way to tell. Now, before we dive into the rest of metabolism, we're gonna have to do a real quick review of some chemistry concepts, and mainly it's gonna be energy and thermodynamics. Now, energy, as you know, is the ability to do work. One example of that would be the potential energy that's stored in a coiled spring. If placed just right, it can push something and make it move, doing work on that object. That stored energy in the form of potential energy is an ability to do work. Some other examples are kinetic energy when something's moving, like I was saying, thermal energy in the form of heat, and chemical energy stored in the bonds of molecules. That chemical energy is going to be vital to metabolism and to life in general. Now, as you've probably encountered before, energy is conserved but can be converted. This is called the first law of thermodynamics, and you may have heard of it as the law of conservation of energy. It's going to be very important because all these processes are going to be converting one form of energy to another. Either in metabolism generally, it'll either be converting it from some form of energy into chemical energy or from chemical energy into some other form of energy. The second law of thermodynamics that we're going to look at is a law that states that every chemical reaction or physical process, but in this case it's going to be chemical reactions, is going to increase the entropy of the universe. Entropy is a measure of disorder. You can think of it as if everything is lined up just perfectly, that's very high order, low entropy, and when everything's just scattered around, that's high disorder, high entropy. Another way of thinking about this is that every chemical reaction is going to decrease the amount of usable energy, because in order for a form of energy to be useful, in order to be able to be used for work, it has to be ordered. For example, you can create heat by rubbing your hands, but you can't use the heat to make something move. Thermodynamics, like I was saying, is it's the study of these energy conversions and just the forms of energy as a whole. One interesting thing we're going to look at, oftentimes there's a misconception that life kind of breaks that second rule of thermodynamics, where it is very high ordered and it's only getting more ordered, more structured. But the reason it follows these laws of thermodynamics is because as you're growing, as you're creating more order and more structure in your body, you're actually decreasing the order of your surroundings. Think of it this way. When you eat, your food's broken down into carbon dioxide and water. That process increases the disorder of those components a lot. It creates a lot of entropy. Whereas as you grow, you only increase in order a little bit at a time, and as a result, over the span of your lifetime, you've created more disorder than you have created order. So that's how life kind of fits into this. Now, using those things, we can start to look at whether or not a process is spontaneous. And in order for that to be true, it has to increase the entropy of the universe. We talked about diffusion in a couple of our videos. This shows a very ordered system in which all the particles are very close together, surrounded by an area where there are no of the same particles. So there is an order here and low disorder, low entropy, and a spontaneous process such as diffusion would cause it to change and look like this, where all the particles are evenly spread, very dispersed, and there's high disorder and low order. A common misconception is that the word spontaneous means that the process inherently has to be fast, but this is not true. Spontaneous does not mean quick. It just means that it will happen without any additional energy input. An example of a contradiction to this would be rust, in which iron will spontaneously rust. You've seen this happen, but this doesn't mean iron will quickly rust. It will not instantly change from iron to iron oxide. It will just it'll just do that without taking any energy. Spontaneous processes are, as the name suggests, any process that is spontaneous, and the way we're going to determine whether or not a process will be spontaneous is what we're going to be looking at in this slide. Free energy is a form of energy, a type of energy that can be used to perform useful work. In other words, like I was saying, it's ordered energy. And the second law of thermodynamics, which states that the entropy of the universe is always increasing, will decrease the amount of free energy. And so that's how that all ties in. The change in free energy measures whether or not a process is spontaneous. So free energy is also sometimes known as Gibbs free energy. That's where the G comes in. Delta always means change in, so delta G is the change in free energy. If it's negative, then that process will be spontaneous. Okay, so earlier I said that in order for a process to be spontaneous, it has to increase entropy. There's another component to it. This equation, delta G equals delta H minus T delta S, we get it from thermodynamics, from chemistry. Delta G, like we said, is Gibbs free energy, and in order for a process to be spontaneous, it has to be negative. Its components are these delta H and T delta S. Delta H means the enthalpy of a system. Generally, it's found in energy stored in the bonds of a material, of a compound. It's often released as heat. So if a chemical reaction or process releases heat, that generally means that delta H is negative because it's releasing the energy stored in its bonds. T stands for temperature in Kelvin, and delta S is the change in entropy. We addressed entropy earlier. So if the entropy is increasing, then this term is negative, entropy of the universe. And if delta H is negative, in other words, if it's releasing heat, then this is going to be negative. And if both of those are negative, then delta G is negative, in which case the process would be spontaneous. So, as just a review, in order for a process to be spontaneous, the system must give up enthalpy, order, or both of them. Now, equilibrium is an interesting case of a spontaneous process in that delta H. And while looking at equilibrium, we're also going to look at stability. So another way of thinking about free energy is that it's a measure of the instability of a system. So think of this pendulum example. When the pendulum is up very high, it has a high free energy because it can do work by dropping down because of gravity. And it is also very unstable because it can easily leave that position, leave that state. So you can see that free energy is tied to that instability. Now, there's a thing called work capacity, and an unstable system has a higher work capacity, meaning it can perform more work. Again, this makes sense. If energy is the ability to perform work, and free energy measures the instability of a system, then the more unstable system will be able to perform more work. Now, in a spontaneous change, like we were saying, the free energy of a system decreases. And this is going to apply in an interesting way to equilibrium, which we're going to be looking at next. Equilibrium is basically, in this case, the center of the pendulum. So where the pendulum will no longer move away. It's where, in order to move in either direction, you'll have to give up G. You'll have to increase the energy of the system, which will not happen spontaneously. In the case of chemical reactions, entropy, which is the disorder, will actually decrease on either side of the equilibrium because you're having more of a certain type of molecule or compound. And so that's why that happens with equilibrium. It's best to have sort of a mix of all the different compounds. Now there's two more definitions we're going to need to learn: exergonic and endergonic reactions. These tie back to our catabolic and anabolic processes. An exergonic reaction is generally going to drive a catabolic process, while an endergonic reaction is going to drive an anabolic process. Let me back up a little bit and give you their actual definitions. An exergonic reaction releases free energy. So this means it's going to be spontaneous. Delta G is going to be negative. And generally it's going to be exothermic, release heat, and it's going to increase the entropy of the universe. So that's what that is. An endergonic reaction is just the opposite. It's going to absorb free energy. In other words, delta G is positive, and it's not going to happen spontaneously. Now here's another cool definition with an isolated system. Now, I've been mentioning systems. A system is just the matter or the piece of matter that we're studying in a certain instance. An isolated system is a type of system where no matter or energy will leave or enter the system. In other words, it's completely cut off from the rest of the universe. We often study isolated systems with thermodynamics and with metabolism just because they obey the rules a little bit better. The other type of system would be an open system, and an open system can exchange matter and energy, which means that when we just look at that system, the matter and energy can change, which disobeys certain physical laws if you don't account for the fact that it's open. Another word for an isolated system is a closed system, which we may be referring to that more often. Now, an isolated system will always reach equilibrium eventually. This is because it'll spontaneously travel toward equilibrium, like I was saying, because equilibrium is the lowest potential energy, G is the lowest free energy, and so equilibrium is where it will go to decrease its G, to get a negative delta G. Now, when a living system, like a cell or your body, when it reaches equilibrium, your life is over. There is no longer any energy to drive the processes that are necessary to life. In order to prevent this from happening, your cell is constantly expelling waste, whether it's ammonia, it's water vapor, carbon dioxide. All these things end up as waste, and by expelling them, it prevents your body from reaching equilibrium. It's constantly getting rid of those products, and that allows for the reactants in any chemical reaction to keep flowing through the reaction. And so that's why life does that. Energy coupling is the last thing we're going to look at. It uses an exergonic process to drive an endergonic process. If you remember back to my earlier example of digesting food and building up muscles, digesting food is an exergonic process. It will happen spontaneously given the right enzymes. On the other hand, building up muscle is an endergonic process. It requires a certain amount of energy in order to happen. And by that whole process is energy coupling. Now, this is the last thing for this video. ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, because it has 3 phosphates, is the way the cell and the body couples different exergonic and endergonic reactions. It's the way it uses energy coupling. ATP is known as the cell's energy currency, and the reason your cell uses ATP rather than like glucose or some other raw product is because ATP is very easy to handle. It's very easy to use, and then reproduce using respiration. The key to its high energy storage is these three phosphate groups. You can see that they have a very high negative charge, and when you get all those negative charges together, it's like coiling up a spring. Remember the spring from earlier. As you know, opposites attract, and as a result, the opposites attract and likes repel. So those like negative charges will want to repel, will want to get away from each other, but those chemical bonds will be holding them into place. Removing a phosphate group through hydrolysis will allow those negative charges to separate, and this is what drives the endergonic reactions in the cell. There are exergonic reactions that we're going to be looking at with respiration in our next couple of videos that will then allow the phosphate group to be reattached to the remainder of the ATP molecule. Now, using ATP, a cell performs chemical work, transport work, and mechanical work. And ATP, like I said, was the energy currency of the cell. It's what drives all of those processes in the cell. Now, this is just kind of a diagram of how ATP actually functions. You can see you got the blue molecule and the red molecule, and if the cell wants to combine them with this reaction, it cannot, because delta G is positive for that reaction. It's actually increasing in free energy, so that won't happen spontaneously. Instead, it'll use a series of these reactions in which, in this case, the blue molecule, it doesn't usually have to be one or the other, but the blue molecule will react with ATP to form a phosphorylated blue molecule, which means that there's an added phosphate group. Phosphorylation is the process of adding a phosphate group to another molecule, and it'll also produce ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, which means it has two phosphates left. This reaction is spontaneous and has a negative delta G because it's breaking up that ATP, the energy currency of the cell. And then it'll go on and do this reaction where this phosphorylated blue molecule will react with the red molecule to form that end product that it wanted, and then a phosphate group. So kind of the net reaction is the blue and the red combine, and ATP breaks down into ADP and phosphate. Because it's breaking the that ATP down into ADP and phosphate, the reaction as a whole is spontaneous. It has a negative delta G. And so really, metabolism is as simple as that.